I would like to welcome everyone to another session of Preservation in Place that is sponsored by Arizona Preservation Foundation and Arizona State Historic Preservation Office. This particular series has been going on since COVID, and we intend to go on for a long time because we understand that many of you do not have the opportunity to leave the office, leave the state, and be able to attend what should be informative, fun, factual presentations dealing with historic preservation. This particular session, and there's also one tomorrow, is dealing with getting it right, writing a historic register nomination. And we try to give you as much practical information, both from, in this case, two people from the State Historic Preservation Office, and also two people who are professionals and have written a number, and I won't have to go into them, but a lot of different National Register nominations, whether it's on single properties or on districts. So a little housekeeping here. We ask everyone to keep your video off, stay muted. If you have questions, you may ask those questions in the chat. For those of you who feel it's necessary, we also have the opportunity to use closed captions when people are speaking. And we will be recording this session. So once the session is over, it will take some time, but we will get the recording and you will be able to find it on the Arizona Preservation YouTube channel. We do let you know when this is happening, that it's been posted, but you could go there now and see some of our past presentations. We also say, if you have an idea of a presentation maybe you would like to give, or perhaps one that a topic that you would find to be most interesting, you can put that on the chat and we will take it into consideration. So in order to get started, I want to explain how this particular session is going to be running. We have a panel that will be moderated by Susan Lawson, who happens to be the architect working for the Arizona State Historic Preservation Office. We also, on this panel, have Dr. William Collins, he goes by Bill, who is the Historic Register Nomination Coordinator. And in this state, that means if you have questions before you ever present it in the system, he would be the person that you would want to discuss your issues. And then our two professionals are Chris Evans and Vince Murray. Both of them have quite a wide range of activities and interests. And, excuse me, they will be giving you some concrete examples of things that they have done, what they've learned, etc., etc. Now, while we get started, let me introduce Susan Lawson. Susan, the architect, I was most impressed in looking at the registration, seeing her in a helicopter, and she never even mentioned that in her bio. So, Susan, take it away.
Hello, thank you. And I suppose the helicopter story is one for another day, but my appreciation to Arizona Preservation Foundation and Donna for inviting us to speak here today. As she said, I'm the architect at the State Historic Preservation Office in Arizona, aka SHPO, and today my job is to be the panel moderator. I wear many hats here. One of them is reviewing Section 7 of the National Register nominations that come in, and that's the architectural description narrative. In doing so over the past couple of years, I noticed there are different approaches that folks take depending on maybe the resources involved or personal style. But I also noticed a lot of similarities based on the recommended approach by the National Park Service. So it was with that in mind that I asked our speakers if collectively today they'd be willing to come together and present their experiences so that you'd have a broader picture and a variety of perspectives in terms of best practices for putting a Section 7 together. We're going to kick off with Bill Collins, the SHPO National Register Coordinator. He'll provide a brief overview on the NR, but mainly focus on Section 7 best practices, as well as resources available to you, and of course the SHPO perspective. Then we'll pass it along to architectural historian Vince Murray, who's going to take us through his process in writing a Section 7 for a single property. And then finish with architect Chris Evans, who's going to focus his portion on writing a Section 7 for historic districts. At that point, we'll all put our cameras on for the panel portion. I've got a few questions lined up for the speakers, and then we'll open it up to your question and answers, which you can put in the chat as Donna noted. So without further ado, Bill Collins, if you'd like to start and share your screen.
Good morning, all. Can you hear? I hope you can hear me. I'm going to share my screen to give my presentation. Hold on a second. Let me make that full screen. And I am ready to go. I'm going to take that off. All right. Good morning. I am an historian and the manager of the National Register of Historic Places program at the Arizona State Historic Preservation Office. That's SHPO or SHPO if you're not already amongst the initiated. But initiation is just what this webinar is all about because it's about the most fundamental organizing principles of the historic preservation movement across America. These are the guidelines of the National Register of Historic Places, the federal government's official list of properties significant in our history and worthy of preservation. The National Register has provided a set of standards for determining what is historic and what is applied by preservationists from the National Park Service to local historic preservation commissions. The National Register terminology organizes how we speak about historic properties. Listing a property in the National Register provides recognition of its value to the community and opens benefits to assist efforts to preserve it in the future. Oops, there we go. Many people are interested in preserving historic properties, but are stymied by the complex and lengthy process for listing. The process can seem like a mysterious black box with arcane rules and an obscure schedule. Preparing a nomination requires an ability to convey descriptive and historical information in writing, a skill all too scarce. It can require research, which many people do not understand or have the time to undertake. And it is not unusual for it to take at least a year for a nomination to move from initial research about the property to final acceptance by the keeper of the National Register in Washington. But the process is not a machine or a conveyor belt. There is a person in the black box whose job it is to move nominations through the process and to assist people to understand what is required. I can be contacted almost any time to answer questions such as whether a property is eligible for the register and how to fill out the registration form. I will begin with a quick overview of the National Register registration form, which you see pictured here, along with the instruction bulletin, how to complete the National Register registration form, otherwise known as Bulletin 16A. If you are new to the National Register, you should have Bulletin 16A open as you move through the form section by section. The bulletin does a good job in walking preparers through each blank on the form, although I should point out that it is obsolete in some regards. For instance, 16A still refers to black and white photo prints and paper USGS maps, which are now digitized. We're here to focus on Section 7, but to put that into perspective, the form has 11 sections that vary in complexity. Here is the registration form in its entirety. It is 12 printed pages in outline, but in fact will be much longer when completed because the form expands to accommodate narrative and text and graphics. When you include photos and maps, completed forms typically range from 20 pages for a relatively simple property to 60 or 70 pages for larger properties like historic districts. Bulletin 16A begins with a section on getting started, which will orient new preparers on what is needed if they are to contemplate nominating a property. I especially want to point out this page of bullet points about applicants being ready to complete the form when they can answer these questions. This is effectively an outline of all the information you need to prepare the form. Running through a few of these bullet points, we can see at the top The question, what is the property called or how is it identified? Next, what is the count of resources that make up the property? Other points include, when was the property constructed and when did it attain its current form? What changes have been made to it over time? How is the property used historically and how is it used today? How does the property relate to themes or trends important in history? And how large is the property and where is it located? If you have answers to these questions, you're ready to write your nomination. The form's first 6 sections are fairly simple and are just blanks to fill out. In section 7, we move into the heart of the nomination form where the work really begins. It starts simply enough with spaces to fill in. The first point, architectural classification, is another way of asking, what style is it? This presumes, of course, that you're dealing with a property that has a recognizable building style, which leaves out properties like sites without buildings or landscapes. But for this webinar, we will be largely defaulting in our discussion to the nomination of buildings and districts. Archaeology, landscapes, and TCPs have their own peculiarities, but Section 7 has its basic features, whatever the property type. Bulletin 16A has a list of data categories for building styles that you are supposed to use when filling out the architectural classifications. This list, however, is pretty out of date, and you may find it difficult to use for buildings in the mid to later 20th century, which is most of what you'll find in Arizona nominations these days. I will say, though, that the keeper is lenient in accepting alternative style descriptions, and their database has been expanding over the years with new categories and subcategories of names drawn from nominations as they're received. This is particularly useful in accommodating regional style names. I will refer you to additional guidance found at the keeper's website, which we'll explore a little bit later. Here are 2 examples of ways that this part has been filled out. At the top, we see the form for the Herenstein House in Tucson, which is described as a part of the modern movement, which is standardized language from Bulletin 16A. In more detail, it is called hyperbolic paraboloid because it is one of those plasticized concrete structures that were experimented with in the mid-20th century. Now, hyperbolic paraboloid is not one of the style categories you'll find in Bulletin 16A, but it is acceptable and the National Register will actually add it to their data categories if need be. If the property is not architectural, then you simply note not applicable, as you can see that was done here for the recently listed Guadalupe Cemetery. There's also a space where you can list maybe I think I gotta go back. There's also a space where you list the property's principal exterior materials. For the Herenstein House, those primary materials were concrete, burnt adobe, and cast concrete. Again, this is presuming the property is a building or structure, and may not be applicable to some properties, as we see again with the Guadalupe Cemetery. Now we're at the part of the form where it becomes really more difficult. The form requires you to write a written narrative description of the property's physical appearance and condition of the property. The description should tell what the property originally looked like and what it looks like now. This is important for evaluating a property's integrity. The description is a narrative, that is, you have to use words to describe the property, but the description may be illustrated as well. And in my view of best practices, illustrations and text should be used together to convey what a property looks like. While old nominations are largely text with appended photos and maps, today you can embed a variety of images in the form. I'm a strong advocate for doing this, in part because, I'm a strong advocate for doing this because as a reader, I find that textual descriptions don't really convey what a property looks like. Also, I find it inconvenient for a reader to have to flip back and forth to different parts of the form to find links to text and photos. I'm also such a strong advocate of embedding photos, in part because I think I'm the first preparer in the country to use a computer to embed images in Section 7 integrated with the text, which I did back in 1995 for the Verde Park Pump House in Phoenix, as you see on this page. Previously, images and maps were appended to the form, or at most photocopied into the form. At least this is the earliest I've ever seen. The registration form actually tells preparers what they're supposed to put into Section 7, and Bulletin 16A has extensive guidance about it. Note especially that you're supposed to describe contributing and non-contributing resources. And sometimes, I'm sorry to say, preparers seem hesitant about fully identifying non-contributing features. Failing to identify non-contributing features, especially when they're readily apparent in aerial photos, is a sure way to get a nomination returned by the keeper. Section 7, as you see here, and Section 8 as well, begin with a required summary paragraph, and I want to focus on this for a moment. I will let you in on a little secret. I've heard keeper staff state that if they read well-written summary paragraphs and get a decent understanding of the property's appearance and integrity, and in Section 8 its significance, then they typically read over the main text in a more cursory manner, although I wouldn't say they skim over the rest. Poorly written summary paragraphs will win the preparer a close scrutiny of the main text. When being asked for in the summary paragraph, what is being asked for in the summary paragraph couldn't be spelled out more plainly, and I'll read it directly. Describe the historic and current physical appearances and conditions of the property. Describe contributing and non-contributing resources if applicable. Begin with a summary paragraph that briefly describes the general characteristics of the property, such as its location, type, style, methods of construction, setting, size, and significant features. Indicate whether the property has historic integrity. What I see with the section summaries, and I see it all the time, are two types of mistakes. First, notice that the instruction asks for a summary paragraph. That's singular. It is not asking for multiple paragraphs. It is not asking for pages of detailed text. It says briefly describe the property's general characteristics and whether it has integrity. The details come later. The second problem I see is that instead of providing a summary description of the property, the preparer here immediately starts writing about the property's history and what makes it significant, and the national register criteria. This is not what is being asked for here in Section 7. It will be asked for in the summary paragraph for Section 8. I have even seen draft nominations where the two summary paragraphs are cut and paste copies. After crafting a concise yet complete summary paragraph, you face this daunting page. Here's where you write the detailed description of the property. How much detail is enough? That varies with the nature of the property. What Bulletin 16A says is that, quote, the amount of detail needed in the narrative depends on the size and complexity of the property and the extent to which alterations, additions, and deterioration may have affected the property's integrity, unquote. Oop, I should have put that on there. You may choose to illustrate your narrative with photos, maps, and aerials and other illustrations, and either embedded with the text so readers may easily see them while they read, or you may gather illustrations at the end and just make references in them in the narrative. Since buildings are the most frequently nominated property type, Bulletin 16A provides extra guidance on how to describe them. You start with a summary paragraph. Then you describe the building in what they call a logical sequence. You may start with the foundation and move up to the roof, describe each facade, exterior and interior. Oh, and about interiors, the rule of thumb is that for buildings nominated individually, the interior and its integrity matter and must be described in Section 7. Historic districts usually require less detail for each contributing resource, and often interiors are not relevant, particularly for residential historic districts. Write clearly and with simple sentences. To some extent, SHPO and HSRC reviewers can help by noting grammatical errors, but ultimately the nomination form will reflect the voice of its preparer. You should focus first on describing the building's current appearance and condition, illustrated with recent photos. You then compare current with historic appearance, noting how the property may have been altered over time. This is the basis for determining whether the property retains physical integrity. If you are preparing a form for a group of buildings, you start with the property's general characteristics, then describe each building one at a time. If you're working with a large historic district, you need not describe each resource in detail. Rather, you should identify whether there are outstanding or pivotal buildings, and then common types of buildings more as a collective. Again, you should note the general condition, original appearance, and major changes to resources. In Arizona, we have traditionally collected information about individual buildings in a potential historic district using Arizona Historic Property Inventory Forms. These inventory forms should have information and photos sufficient to determine that they are contributing resources, which we will use as the baseline for identifying whether later alterations have affected the resource's integrity. In describing a historic district, Bulletin 16 recommends following a logical progress, such as moving from one building to the next or up and down each street in a geographical sequence. Bulletin 16A then provides 4 pages of guidelines advising you how to describe various types of properties, and I recommend that you have these pages open while you're preparing your descriptions because they provide an outline that ensures that you've covered every important point. The guidelines are organized by property type. You can see outlines provided for buildings, structures, objects, for sites, both historic and archaeological, and for districts. These outlines are the skeleton on which a preparer will flesh out a compelling case for the property's integrity. This is all I have to say regarding the outline of Section 7. Our other presenters, especially Vince Murray and Chris Evans, will describe the challenges of actually preparing these documents for a variety of type of historic resources. If you are nominating a building and you're wondering what to write in that blank page 7, you may use this outline. You begin by telling what is the type or form of the building. Describe the setting around it, both current and historic. Tell whether the building has decorative features of note, perhaps features that are characteristic of a high style. Again, if you're working with an individually nominated building, you should describe interior features. You need to identify outbuildings on the property as well as other constructed features like roads and landscaping. It is very important to describe alterations to the property as the basis for evaluating its integrity. You should also describe whether deterioration has had an impact on the property's integrity. Although there are guidance points on special cases such as buildings that have been moved or restored. All right, that's basically what I have to say as a way of introduction to Section 7. As I say, our other presenters will talk about how to actually prepare that document in detail as their experience has taught them. I want to move in for a little bit of time, rest of my time, to look at the resources that the Keeper of the National Register has for guidance on best practices. I want to go over some of the points that the Keeper considers best practices. I will show you where this guidance is and look at some of the examples. Now, if you're a one-time nomination preparer, like someone writing a nomination for their own house, this best practices material is somewhat superfluous. When I work with non-professionals, I find many can only take a nomination so far. Not everyone knows how to research the history of a property or develop a historic context or write in a clear narrative format. That's where I step in, not just to provide editing comments, but also when I can to supplement the nomination when I have material to add, and occasionally research assistance when I can. However, if you are someone who may prepare more than one nomination, either as an advocate or as a professional, you will be rewarded if you take the time to become aware of what differentiates a well-prepared nomination from one that is either inadequate or barely adequate. What's wrong with barely adequate, you may ask? Skirting the boundaries of the minimally acceptable makes it more likely that either the HSRC or the Keeper's Office will reject a nomination and return it for revisions. If one is concerned about the extensive time it can take to nominate a property, consider the efficiencies achieved by doing it right the first time. Particularly if you are a professional consultant, these best practices aids should be part of your toolkit. You can hold on a second. I need to wave my office light back on because timer just timed out. Hold on. Thank you. I have light again. The National Register has a very good website full of resources about the criteria and process of nomination. If you are an historic preservation professional and work with the National Register in a regular way, you should have this web page bookmarked as it rewards regular revisits to see what has been updated. If you are new to historic preservation, this is your research library with everything you need to become an expert on all things National Register. You see here the homepage which links to, for example, just released material. Here you see the recently released update to the Traditional Cultural Places Bulletin. If you're new to the National Register, you may want to start with "What is the National Register" link, which takes you to material explaining what the register is all about, what it means to be listed, and frequently asked questions. The guidance and how to list a property, links are your chief resources for understanding both the process of nominating a property and guidance material on how to fill out the nomination form. If you're looking for information about what is already listed in the National Register, they have an online database for listed properties, and many of these have PDFs of their nomination forms available for download. This is helpful if you're looking for examples of nominations or wanting to know what is listed in a particular community. And here are a few more links from their homepage. The weekly list tells you what just got approved for listing. The NR features link takes you to properties and topics that they want to highlight. For example, here they've highlighted properties related to the Civilian Conservation Corps, historically Black colleges, and summer camps. The National Register update links lets you know what the latest material added to the website, such as new guidance bulletins and white papers. The last link on the homepage takes you to information about federal rehabilitation tax credits. This program has supported the rehabilitation of hundreds of historic commercial properties in the U.S., perhaps thousands by now. It is one of the major benefits and incentives for nominating a property to the National Register. Returning to the homepage, if you click on the guidance link, you will go to this page. Here you will find links to the Advisory Bulletin series, which includes Bulletin 16A, samples of nominations you can use as models, special topic training videos, the laws and regulations, and other materials. Let's look at a couple. In addition to Bulletin 16A, the Park Service publishes several other bulletins with guidance on special topics. The Challenges of Nominating Archaeological Sites has its own bulletins, and there are bulletins on nominating properties associated with important people, with tricky properties like rural historic landscapes, cemeteries, and properties less than 50 years old. Each of these criteria considerations are explained in detail in their own bulletins. The most recently published bulletin is a long-awaited revision to the one on traditional cultural places, or TCPs. If you click on Workshops, and then again on that page, you'll be taken to a web page of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. On this page, you will find 19 training videos covering different aspects of the National Register program and answering the most frequently asked questions. Here are a few examples. On this, here we have a video on how to amend a nomination. Common nomination errors, that's a good one. The video on evaluating integrity relates to one of the most difficult aspects of nominating and historic property to the register. This video on the criteria and areas of significance gets to the heart of what makes a property eligible. It would have been a good training video just to queue up these videos and watch them. I'm going to put on one about the common nomination errors so you can see what is there, just as an example. And this takes just a few minutes to watch.
Bill, this is Susan. I have no sound from the video. Not sure if other people have the same challenge.
Let me see what I can do. Okay. I don't know if I can fix that, so I'm simply going to skip it. But you can see that they have these videos. So if in case you didn't hear that, I'm going to skip that since apparently people are having problems hearing it. But again, you go to their website and you can see those. They're really good. All right, going back to the guidance page, we'll click on the publications link. This takes us to a very important page that is rich with guidance documents, and it is where I will spend the remainder of my presentation this morning. We see at the top a link to the recently released TCP bulletin. Below the TCP bulletin link is the list of relatively new series called the Best Practices Review, which used to be called White Papers. I will focus on these shortly. At the bottom, you see links to information sheets that briefly answer specific questions like what is the National Register, what is the National Register landmarks, and what is integrity. Scrolling down the page, you get to the list of National Register bulletins that you can download as PDFs. I previously pictured some of these bulletins, but here are a few more on technical issues like the updated photo policy. This is important because the old Bulletin 16A on how to prepare a nomination hasn't been updated to acknowledge the transition from physical to digital photos and maps. Here's another fundamental bulletin, researching a historic property. If you don't have a background in historical research, you will find this bulletin invaluable. Nominations require boundary descriptions and boundary justifications. If you have a large, multi-features, multi-owner, or otherwise complex property, you may face a dilemma over how to define boundaries. For instance, should a non-historic feature of a property be classed as non-contributing within the boundary, or have the boundary drawn to exclude the feature? This technical bulletin is a consolidation of previous guidance for both historic and archaeological properties. Archaeologists should find this bulletin particularly helpful, as well as anyone working with historic districts. This guidance page is very long, and we can scroll down to see several more guidance documents. I said that the photograph requirements have transitioned from physical to digital photographs. Likewise, the required mapping of properties no longer has to be done with paper USGS maps. Here you find how to fulfill the mapping requirements with digital topographic maps. But you also have the option to use satellite imagery, such as Google Earth, to locate your property. There's even an online webinar to help explain digital mapping. Now here's something buried fairly low on the page, but is incredibly helpful if you're preparing a nomination. These are the checklists that the National Register staff at the Keeper's Office use to make sure the form is filled out correctly. This checklist is the first phase of a nominations review at the Keepers. Here's where they make sure that the registration form, section by section, is complete and every checkbox and narrative space has been filled out. Has the name been entered in section 1? Has the preparer included the historic and current functions of the property? Are there summary paragraphs, biographic information, maps, and photos? If you want to know if your nomination is complete, just go down this checklist for yourself and you will have anticipated any omission that Keeper staff will be on the lookout for. While the technical checklist you just saw helps you review your draft nomination to ensure completeness, the substantive review checklist helps the reviewer to analyze the quality of the form's description of the property and justification for its eligibility. You see that most of this form is looking at the narrative statements in Section 7 and Section 8. In your Section 7 and descriptive narrative, did you describe the property's character-defining features? Have you described the property's setting? Have you described how the property may be altered? Does it retain integrity? Have all the contributing features and non-contributing features been identified? And is the section narrative clear and complete? Here's where comes in the subjective judgment of the nominations reviewer, from SHPO to the HSRC and up to the Keeper's Office. We're all looking to, at least figurative, check that box that says, after reading this nomination, I know what this property is, what physical features are important, and whether it retains integrity. Now we've reached the last topic that I will cover this morning, which is to look a little closer at the National Register's Best Practices series. They have been developed by the Keeper's staff based on their experience of reviewing countless nominations from across the country. As you didn't really see in the video about common errors, there is a pattern of recurring weaknesses in nominations that these are trying to alleviate. Here's one for a question that will probably have occurred to anyone who has worked with nominating a historic residential district. Evaluating garages and outbuildings in historic districts. Regarding Section 7, Specifically, you will find this review particularly helpful on developing a complete and concise property description. And what is their first heading? Start with a summary paragraph, as I described earlier. While there are several useful words of wisdom in this publication, I will point out this one about remember to review, which actually has two useful points. First, double check your numbers. If you are working with a district or complex property, you will be writing about numbers of buildings, objects, structures, and sites, and which are contributing or non-contributing. Make sure you have consistent numbers throughout. Second, include in section 7 a list of those resources, and make sure that your site map is consistent with your list. Let me make sure that's repeated. That is very important. Make sure your site map is consistent with your list. All too many times people will be making revisions in their nominations. They may make a change to their list and then forget to change the map as well. And to illustrate the importance of keeping up with guidance from the Keeper's office, I received this little note just this very morning from our reviewer at the Keeper staff, Rachel Leibowitz. Rachel has been our reviewer since the start of the year after our former reviewer, Paul Lusignan, retired. She reports that they're working on a new version of the form, and then says that in order to meet their accessibility guidelines, they want preparers to use particular fonts. She lists Arial, Calibri, and Aptos in particular. Well, that affects me since I always use New Times in Roman. So I take note, and take note yourself. I think this should suffice for an introduction to Section 7 and best practice and guidance on best practices. Now I'll pass the meeting back to Susan, who will introduce our other panelists and will explain how they apply this guidance when they prepare and review nominations. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. I'm overwhelmed by the amount of information you shared, and as someone who just reviews Section 7, there are resources there that I did not know about that are available to me. So thank you very much. We always continue learning. Next, I'm going to introduce Vince Murray, who's an architectural historian, and he's going to share with us a case study of a single building Section 7 description for Peoria, Old Main. Vince, if you're ready, go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. Everybody can see it? Hope so. All right, so I chose for an example would be doing a case study on Peoria, Old Main, which I think I did back in 2017. I think it's a good example. Yeah.
We can also see your notes.
Oh, you can see the notes.
And they're on top of the image.
Oh, okay, that's really screwed up. Let me move this over here. Hold on. You got it that time?
You're good now?
Okay, except I'm on the screen, but let's see. There we go. Okay, Peoria, Old Main. Okay. I thought I had this thing straightened out with the notes. So anyhow, so going back to 2017 with putting this thing together, and certainly I think it's a good example to follow up what Bill was saying with, doing the layout of a National Register nomination section 7, and drafting up, like you said, the original summary paragraph that you need, and then the narrative description that kind of goes along with it. And this is Peoria, Old Main. If you've ever been up to that location up in Peoria, it's not one of these things that you normally see that easily because it's location, and that's kind of addressed in the nomination as well. So for the summary, I wrote it up. Peoria High School, Old Main is located on the Peoria High School campus in the city of Peoria, Arizona. Built in 1922 and designed in the Spanish colonial revival style by the locally prestigious architecture firm of Lesher, Kibbe, and Mahoney, the historic school building is 2 stories tall with a daylight basement. The foundation is concrete, and the walls are a combination of concrete and brick sheathed in stucco with terracotta ornamentation. The main classroom building has a truncated cross-hip roof clad in clay tile. The auditorium wing has a flat roof with clay tile coping on the parapets. The front facade of the building is embellished with Churrigueresque ornamentation. The building has received some additions and alterations, but continues to possess a high level of integrity. Now that hits all the points that Bill is basically talking about, giving a description of the location of where it's at, both on a large level, being in Peoria, Arizona, but also that it's located on this campus. Then you go into providing some of the details of the building itself, but you don't have to go into a lot of information to put into it, because that's where you're really going to, kind of take that out from the narrative section that you build off from that. So now I'm trying to figure out how I switch back and forth between these. So Old Main, situated in the northeast portion of the campus of the Peoria High School in Peoria, Arizona, a suburban city of 163,000 residents, located approximately 14 miles northwest of downtown Phoenix. So this was actually accompanied to the nomination to give an idea of where it is in reference to the downtown. It's the high school is a campus covering 38 acres with multiple use area of agricultural, commercial, and residential properties, and is located 1/2 mile north of Peoria Old Town Quarter and Municipal Complex. That's kind of noted in because you do have National Register stuff that's down there. And this has the map that kind of shows you in that reference. And then going a little closer into it, Old Main surrounded on 3 sides, north, south, and west, by newer campus buildings, separated by a concrete walkway. And we give a kind of a layout right here of what the boundaries of what we're going to be dealing with. And you can see that there are a number of buildings and other structures that are on the site. We're going to be very focused on the one. Why the subject property is orange in my key but black on the map, I don't know. But apparently they didn't catch that at the National Register, because I took this directly from them. But we go into the details now of what you're going to see. So surrounded on 3 sides, north, south, and west, by newer campus buildings, separated by a concrete walkway. To the east and northeast are parking lots. To the south and southeast are the landscaped open space, the western portion of which is included in the nomination. This latter area offers the best view of the building, which we're looking at here, creating a symmetrical relationship between building and landscape. So I'm dealing here with this comment with an issue of integrity, but I'm not going out there and saying I'm dealing with the issue of integrity. But I'm pointing out why, even though it's surrounded by a whole bunch of other buildings, when you looked at from this view, it still is able to convey its historic significance. So the landscape Old Main is minimal. It's mature. It's immaculately maintained. It consists of a flood irrigated lawn and palms flanking a central 2-path concrete walkway that leads to the entrance of the building. The walkways border a flagpole, fountain, and a series of 3 raised garden beds on alignment with the entrance. The fountain was built after the period of significance and is a non-contributor to this nomination, as are the 3 garden beds in the series and the 2 flanking the entrance. The flagpole dates to the construction of the building. So that ends up being a contributor here. And I note those things out because these are built portions of the environment that are going to be identified in the review as to whether these things should be historically significant or not. The architects designed Old Main in the Spanish colonial revival style. It is a 2-story building with a T-shaped plan built of a combination of reinforced concrete and brick walls clad in stucco. The main classroom building is 190 feet long and 65 feet deep, aligned on an east-west axis with a 40-foot wide auditorium wing extending 69 feet from the north at the rear of the building. Let's see here. So now we show that we've got the back end portion of that over here. Okay. The main entrance to Old Main is centered on the classroom building's southern facade, and the auditorium centered and perpendicular to the northern facade. The roof of the classroom building's cross-hipped, truncated, and sheathed in clay tile. In cornice eaves, small wings extend from the main building, as you can see here. And these are all included within the nomination and are referenced within the nomination as well. The roofs of these wings match the roof of the main building and are also hipped, truncated, and clay tile. Auditorium built of concrete and brick with a stucco finish is a 1 1/2 story talls with a recessed, albeit windowless basement and a flat roof with low parapets capped with a hipped clay tile coping. Auditorium has 2 small single-story wings that were gender-specific dressing rooms. Okay. And similar to the auditorium, the wings also have flat roofs with low parapets capped with a hip clay tile coping. The main entrance to Old Main is within the recessed bay of the southern facade with a shed-roofed pediment clad in clay tiles and supported by terracotta Solomonic columns with composite capitals. If you look closely, you can see those columns there and how they kind of swirl up, which is supposed to, I think, represent the growth of wheat, but they are referred to as Solomonic columns. Terracotta pilasters and matching capitals within the bay provide depth to the arcade, located in the arch above the entrance, in the keystones of the arches, on the capitals of the columns, and above the windows and flanking the entrance are the Tudor-Guresque embellishments. And there's an example of that. Okay. The classroom building can be accessed by the 2 small wings and doorways adjacent to the auditorium. These latter entrances are accessible by a staircase and ramp on the respective west sides of the east and west sides of the auditorium, which provide access to the west and east doors of the auditorium. So we have the entrances on the side. And I think, I had another one that had the handicap ramp up back over here, the ADA ramp. Then the doors to the classroom building and auditorium are metal and fixed, single lights above the main entrance, which has the double doors of fixed multi-light transom. Similar transoms are above the doors in the rear of the building. The west and east entrances to the auditorium have double doors. The stage and dressing room entrances are respectively solid slabbed with fixed transoms and single lights. I didn't include all the photographs because I didn't want to drive you guys crazy with a million of them here. So then dealing with the issues of integrity, and when they talk about the 7 aspects of the integrity, there are basically 2 schools of thought. One is to list out what those 7 aspects are, and then describe how the building fits within each of those various aspects. However, in looking at the various aspects and then looking at your project, you'll see that not everything falls within specific portions of the aspects of integrity. So what I like to do is to just kind of write it into the narrative itself in the integrity section so that it's understandable without going into a lot of details, because there are things like a feeling, I mean, how does this feel as a school? And it's kind of hard to convey that emotional relationship. So here's what we put together on the integrity of the building to address that part of it. And of course, a lot of what we have within this description is actually described additionally within the Section 8, which Dr. Doug Kupel will be talking about tomorrow, but it gives more of an explanation as to the chronology of how these things came about as well, and the modifications and things like that. So integrity. The historic setting of Old Main has changed. When originally built, it was the only building centered on a 10-acre lot surrounded by hundreds of acres of farmland. The original high school trustees envisioned numerous buildings on the school campus, which were in fact added later. Since the building's construction, the campus has grown over time, almost quadrupling in the original size to 39 acres. And by the end of the 20th century, residential subdivisions and commercial establishments replaced most of the agricultural properties surrounding the school. With the exception of Old Main, all of the current buildings and structures located on the high school campus date to the 1970s or later. And keep in mind, this was back in 17, so evaluating under the 50-year age requirement for the National Register, they were not 50 years old at the time. While these changes affect the setting, the open lawn in front of the Old Main maintains the vantage point of view of the building, contributing to its historic aesthetic and symmetry, and is included within the nomination boundaries. Now, this goes back to justify the description that we had at the very beginning when we were talking about the setting that's out there when you're coming in. So you're really breaking it down from everything that you see outside and then dialing in closer to what it was. When completed in 1922, a set of stairs from the first floor of the west end of the classroom building were to lead to an arcade connecting to a shop building that was never built. And this is kind of important because we include within Section 8 some of the original plans that actually show some of those architectural features that are not on this building. And that gives the explanation as to Why do we not see those since you included those within your section 8? So going on here, on the opposite end of the building were a set of windows. And in 1958, the school erected external stairwells at both ends of this building, removing chimneys. Unlike earlier stairs on the west of the building, the stairwells provided access to the second floors as well as the first. And this modification was performed for safety reasons. So we make a justification for this impact to the integrity of the building, but it's done for safety reasons. So it's still out there. A terracotta cornice graces the second floor of the main building, but was apparently removed from the auditorium during remodeling of the wings in 1963. During this remodeling, the windows of the auditorium were also filled in, smoothing over rectangular openings while leaving the decorative openings that evident. So those are those arches that you saw that are just kind of filled in there. The windows of Old Main were originally wood, multi-light, and either double-hung casement or Hauser awning style. Beginning in 1963 and through 1992, many of the windows were replaced with smaller, single-hung aluminum. During a recent remodeling, the windows were replaced with fixed anodized aluminum windows sized to the window openings. That is an integrity issue there because the fenestration has been modified, those original windows going out, and in some cases, the windows shrinking down a little bit in size. In 2008, the building was experiencing structural issues and was closed. With bond funds, the district began a $6.5 million rehabilitation project in 2011 that lasted 2 years. During this time, the roof structure was removed, rebuilt, and then reclad in clay tile to maintain its historic appearance. Modifications were made to the classrooms to allow for more contemporary multi-purpose uses, such as movable walls to create collaborative spaces. The project was included in the installation of the aforementioned energy-efficient insulated fixed windows to increase safety and add comfort to the building and allow Old Main to be used year-round. So as I stated, I pointed out that these windows were modified, which does have a detrimental effect on the integrity, but it also shows here that the modifications actually allowed for the continuation of the use of the building and made it more useful year-round, whereas before it would be closed during the summertime because it gets a little warm in Peoria, Arizona. So as noted, these contemporary changes to the building illustrate the changing safety and construction requirements to address evolving needs of the school and do not detract substantially from the integrity of the building. Instead, they reinvigorate the usefulness of the community landmark by repurposing it for 21st century educational use while preserving its historic character. Okay, that's it. So we had that one summary paragraph that basically was the summary of everything I basically stated. I just fleshed it out a lot more. I didn't put a lot of the details in the summary paragraph. Now, as Bill had stated, you write the summary paragraph and then you look at the narrative and you go, oh my God, this is not going to be an easy thing to do, which is why you should really not do it that way. What you should do is you should write your descriptive information out and really just put as much information in there as you possibly can. Maybe go back and remove any redundancies, scale it back for some various things, evaluating the integrity as you go along. And then once you have all of that done, take that information and summarize it into one paragraph. Then it's not so intimidating. So you're kind of going backwards from what you have from the narrative description and creating it instead of just doing a summarization and then trying to flesh out that summarization by putting those in. And it's a little deceptive because it seems like, well, you just need, to have, a couple of paragraphs are out there, but the more detail that you can provide, the better, especially if you're looking at the criterion C where you're dealing with an issue of architecture. But a lot of times you need to also keep in mind how the setting works and the adaptive reuse if you're going to be looking at a criterion A. And criterion B, of course, has its own issues. So there you have it. That's a case study for doing the section 7. And I look forward to hearing any questions that you guys might have after we move on from that. Okay.
Thank you very much. That was pretty interesting. I've not visited the building, but next time I'm in the area, I'll certainly take a drive over. A lot of our Section 7s are single buildings, but a lot of them are also historic districts. And from what I understand, there is a different thought process and structure that goes along with those nominations. So I would like to introduce Chris Evans to you, an architect who has done a couple of those kinds of Section 7s for us, and he'll explain how he goes through his process. Chris, are you ready to share?
Yes. Hello. Thank you for having me on this. I'd like to start off by saying that most of the National Register work that I do is really focused on mid 20th century residential neighborhoods, and in where a lot of the properties are of a similar scale. They typically are single family houses and have a similar character. So what I'm going to talk about today really, is coming from that that structure, and I'm dealing with that kind of property. Hopefully, it has some applicability more broadly as well. So I'd like to start off with three sort of ideas that help me to organize my approach to writing a narrative description for Section 7. The first is that I really focus on the idea of creating an outline and to help to structure the document. And what I'll typically do is actually keep the headings from the outline within the body of the document. And what I've found that helps in a couple of ways. One, it helps to focus the writing so that if the heading is writing about the streetscape, that's what you're writing about in that space, and we're trying to cover so much ground in Section 7 that I think being able to focus the writing can be very helpful. The other thing I think it does is it simplifies the transitions in the writing, so that it's very clear to the reader. I mean, you're not having to worry about the language transition from one section to another, and the reader knows right away what you're talking about. The second idea is I typically work from the general to the specific, or from the large scale to the small scale. I do that in the writing and if I can, also in the images as well. And third, I try to be, I think of Section 8 as really the place where you're telling the real story. I mean, that's where the significance is. And that Section 7 is really about sort of setting the stage so that in giving enough information to the reviewers to understand the property, so that they can, when you're talking about significance, that they have a really good understanding of what's actually there. So I tend to really focus on sort of focusing on the existing conditions and describing the sort of almost in a matter of fact way the properties. And so I actually tend to I think I tend to limit the historical information and only use historical information as needed. And some of that is necessary, but I'm really trying to focus on describing what's actually there and how that's evolved over time. Hold on one second. This is not. So I'll typically start with describing the physical context. Where is this located? And so I'll start that. So again, starting from that big picture and talking about, thinking about a reviewer that's in Arizona. Where are they? If a reviewer that's not in Arizona, excuse me, that's maybe in Washington or elsewhere. That we need to give them, really good understanding of the context in which this is located. So I'll talk about, things in terms of geographic terms, most of the work I do is in Tucson, so we're talking about the desert, but also the mountains have a really important implications for how things have developed in Tucson. And then culturally, we talk about things like the proximity of Tucson to the border, the city of Tucson, and talk about where this might be located within the city of Tucson. From there, I'll start talking more about the immediate context. I'll typically talk about how the boundaries of the proposed district are defined, and then also what surrounds the proposed district. So, is it residential neighborhoods, commercial properties, or major thoroughfares, natural features? I'll try and give, again, that context so that when we get to describing the property itself, the reviewers have a sense of what is there and what's around it. Sometimes you need to talk about that in terms of how it's evolved. In many of these cases, when the subdivision might have been built, there was very little around it, and those other subdivisions or other structures have been built up over time, and you want to clarify that. From there, I'll begin to just talk about the description of the actual district itself, and I'll, again, starting from the larger scale, I'll talk about the layout or the planning of the development. In many cases, that means talking about the street configuration, but it can also consider other elements like drainage ways, pedestrian paths. I've worked on a project where the layout was the project was built within an orchard, and so the trees in the orchard had played a significant role in the layout of the development. From there, I'll typically talk about the land use and thinking about is it residential properties, commercial properties. I'll talk about the size of the lots, the placement of the house on the property and how it relates to the street, and also talk about the yards and where those are located. I mean, how those are configured. And again, getting more and more into the detail, start talking then about the streetscape. And here, you're talking about the streets and the character of the street. Sometimes that can be more urban or more rural or more suburban. And here's where I start to talk about landscape and how landscaping is affecting the experience of the streetscape. And then I'll generally talk about how, because the landscaping is typically what has evolved most significantly over time, that they'll talk about the evolution of the streetscape or the landscaping as part of that. And then from there, I'll get into the architecture, again, getting into more detail. I'll typically start and just provide information about the style of the architecture, but I try not to rely on the idea of style as providing a lot of information. I assume typically that the reviewers are not going to have the same understanding of what a style is, that I do. Particularly if they're coming from another location. So I'll describe things like the size, the form, character, the materials, and then also talk about the range of expression within the district. Some districts there's a lot of continuity, a homogeneity in the architecture. In other districts, there's a lot of different kinds of stylistic expression, and so I'll talk about that. And then of course I'll talk about the modifications that have been done in the architecture. But I have to, in a district, you really have to talk about that in general terms. You can't in the districts of these kinds of sizes where there are hundreds of properties, you can't talk about the individual properties, but you can talk about the patterns of development that have occurred over time. And so I'll talk about those kinds of things in general terms. And then from there, I'll go into talking about integrity. And I'll typically start discussing integrity with, laying out results of the evaluation, how many properties have been identified as contributors to the district. And then I'll talk about in general terms about the patterns of changes that have occurred. A lot of, typically windows, for instance, window replacement is a common change. Carports being converted to garages. And so I'll talk about those things in those kind of general ways. But I'll also talk about other, I'll talk about the most common, but I'll also talk about lesser common changes as well, so that there's a sort of a full perspective on that. And then from there, I'll talk about the period of significance. Typically, there'll be properties within a district that don't fit within the period of significance. And so, the age might be an older property. It could also be a newer property. And so this is one of those places where you really do have to talk about some history, and you end up kind of, I find myself repeating somewhat what's in Section 8, but I try to be very streamlined in how I do that, so that I give the reviewer, since they haven't read Section 8 yet, I try to give the reviewer just a little bit of background about what establishes the period of significance, so that they can understand why these properties that don't fit within that period of significance, and why it is that they don't fit or are included that way. And then typically from there, I'll talk about I'll refer to the 7 aspects of integrity that are identified by the National Register. And I kind of use that as an organizing tool and as a way of sort of measuring what I've written so far. And then I'll typically include a few sentences about the various aspects of integrity that are particularly significant to the project I'm working on. And then from there, I'll typically include a table of resources. So just to kind of reiterate, my primary recommendations are in how I'm approaching writing a narrative. I really find that an outline structure is really helpful in structuring organizing the writing. Again, working from the general to the specific, I think is very effective in most cases. And again, this idea of matter-of-fact description, that you're really trying to report, almost like newspaper reporting, it's not quite technical writing, but that you're really just trying to lay out the facts of what's there. A couple of other thoughts. I try to limit the adjectives I'm using in Section 7. I'm really, again, trying to not make a case about significance here. So I try to use, I think of it as kind of dispassionate language, providing a description without an evaluation of quality in Section 7, because I need to be able to, I need to have more context to be able to make the case for significance later on. So I'll use words like informal or modest, suburban, rural. Sometimes I'll use a word like intimate. I don't know if I've used picturesque in Section 7, but I'm trying not to sort of cross over into that line of describing making some judgment or evaluation at that point. And then also, in reviewing some of the districts that I've worked on, it really seems like I tend to limit the amount of historic imagery and discussion that's in Section 7, and limit it to what's necessary to explain things, because I'm ultimately going to be repeating much of that information in Section 8. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. That was a really nice, the word foil to Vince's description. I'm looking through the questions I wrote, and it looks like a lot of them were answered already, which is fabulous. And one of them actually matches Andrea's question in the chat, which was about, do you have any favorite resources you like to use for architectural vocabulary? I guess my question is maybe a little larger. Is there like a minimum threshold that one needs for architectural vocabulary to be able to write a successful Section 7? Some people are coming to the table with training. Some people are not, and this is their new one. I know Vince and I both dropped a couple of our favorite resources there. So I guess maybe I'm going to push us over to Chris. If you have a favorite resource you'd like to share with the group. And Bill, what are the expectations from maybe SHPO and Park Service in terms of mastering architectural vocabulary for this section?
I know for myself, I don't know necessarily have a favorite that I would refer to, or that I think of right, off the top of my head. I mean, there's such a wide range of expression, and I mean, most of the work I do is 20th century, tends to be more on the modern side, and so. I'm not covering nearly the sort of range that other people are in that way. I don't know that I have a great resource that I refer to is singular. Um,
Do you
so
And
know?
the
if
National
there's something
Register,
specific, I'll maybe add that to the chat.
yeah, the National Register Bulletin lists a couple of books that they think people should refer to, and I definitely think that helps a lot when you're dealing with houses, and you're trying to figure out that type of style. So you have McAllister, and I think Whiffen is out there, and they have some things that are in there, and they're not necessarily perfect, but they're the guys who recommended them. So that does kind of make it a little easier when you're trying to work with a style. And I think, you were saying, Chris, that, you're dealing with more of the mid-century stuff. When you go back and you're dealing with a lot of the revival stuff, there's such a mixture sometimes of styles that are within that you're kind of scratching your head on, is this a variation of Spanish colonial or are we seeing something that's more Mediterranean, et cetera, et cetera. So depending on how you try to define that, it doesn't hurt to be able to go back to one of those books and say, well, this is this style based upon what these guys say, which is the book that you guys recommended that we use. And that way you don't have to necessarily be an expert on the style, but you have something out there that you have as a reference point. Because I think it's McAllister that I don't know if they do Spanish colonial revival build. Don't they refer to it as like Spanish eclectic or something like that? So it's a little bit of a deviation, and it doesn't fall into that list of what they have within the bulletin on the various different revival styles, but they kind of include it in that way. And because they do it in that way, you could still utilize it that way. So that's just kind of, something to kind of think about. But that's dealing with like residential buildings. And as Chris said, that it depends on what the project is and how you're going about it and what that reference is going to be. So that's why I had mentioned the architecture and construction, because that's the one that you're going to find things like Quarro windows and tympanums and things like that you really have no idea, what you're looking at and saying, I know it's something, but I don't know what it is, kind of thing. And the more you can find something that's illustrated, the better. If it's got pictures in there, because that really does help. But I do know that on a few projects, I think it was a Casa del Northern, I was, like grasping at architectural features that Benny Gonzalez had included on some of the things and then calling and talking to architects saying, would you call this feature this? Because I don't know what else to call it, kind of thing. So yeah, that can be a little tough. But if you're just doing something that's relatively simplistic, I think you can probably find whatever reference information you need out of the ones that are recommended by the bulletin.
We have a few folks who have dropped more titles in the chat, so just be sure to check those and put them on your personal list. I would like to hear from Bill about if there's anything, since you've been reviewing them for so many years now, if there are any books you use personally when you do a review.
McAllister's probably the one I pick up the most, but it is, as Vince mentioned, focused on houses. Now, some other kind of properties, commercial and governmental, might have very strong stylistic aspects to them, and you can still use McAllister to some degree. But I actually have quite a great deal of difficulties with Section 7s, and I do not have a firm command of architectural terms myself. So Section 7 is very difficult for me, except for the very simplest of buildings. I also have like architectural dictionaries on my shelf. So if I see a term, particularly when it's being used by somebody else, I'll pull out the dictionary and say, oh, what are they talking about? Are they using that term correctly? Things like that.
Right.
So it's more like for me to understand what other people have written more than necessarily what to use it myself. For example, Vince did a nomination for the Celebrity Theater here in Phoenix, and it had some excellent context on on concrete in the mid-century, the pre-stressed and post-tension kind of concrete technologies, things, which, when I'm reviewing those sort of things, I have to get out the books and start looking at them myself to understand what they're talking about.
That was a tough one because in doing it while the Phoenix had listed on their register under an association with entertainment and its architecture stuff, it did not have the integrity threshold for being listed on the National Register that way. So we ended up doing it under engineering, and I am not an engineer. My grandfather was. He drove a train though, so there's nothing that trickled down from that. So I had to learn all this engineering terminology and try to figure out, post tension, pre-stressed, all of this stuff. And then in reviewing what they had on the plans and then try to put it all together. And I think it went through the HSRC very quickly because nobody understood it. And then Bill said, before we send it to the keeper, can you dummy it down a little bit so people can understand it? And I was like, I barely understand it myself, but I'll try what I can do, to make that work. So yeah, that was a real challenge. And that's what will happen on a lot of other things too, that you've got to kind of reach out there and see what else is out there. And I do highly recommend, using the National Register's database as a resource too, because you might find similar projects that were done by someone else, if not in Arizona or in another states, where they might have information that might be more similar to what you're trying to work with and be able to put it together to convey it that way.
So I'm going to take this conversation, sort of move it into a different direction. How far in the weeds, this is probably for Chris, how far in the weeds do you take descriptions when it comes to a district, right? I can understand you have one building, you're sort of just really describing it in great detail. But when you have 100 buildings in a district, there's not enough space, time, and probably necessity to describe them all in such detail with these architectural words. How do you do that in a district nomination?
Well, I tend to look at things from the perspective of patterns. Looking. If it's a development where it was the houses were all built by a single developer, for instance, then there's typically a lot of continuity in the materials and the forms, and so you can talk about those patterns much more clearly. In the case of a district where there's more disparate expressions, I'll typically talk about things from a stylistic standpoint and talk about what the most common style is in the district, and then what the other style, and try to identify all the styles that are evident in the district. But I don't necessarily get into just talking about the specifics in the style itself. The detailing within, that sort of, defines that style. I do in that situation kind of rely on that. I will talk more about the form of the buildings and the relationship of the buildings to the streetscape or to each other in that case. But rarely am I getting into the detailing of the architecture unless it seems like it's particularly significant to the district.
Susan, can I add to that?
Please.
One thing that kind of distinguishes Arizona from some other states, as I understand, is our use of the Arizona Historic Property Inventory Form. That is something separate, although related to the development of an historic district nomination, because it provides documentation for each individual element or features. Usually every house will have its own form, and it'll have a photo or two and some description and evaluation of its integrity. Enough information there to determine whether the property is a contributor or non-contributor. Now, some states don't do things like that. They have no equivalent of our inventory form, and they do use the nomination to describe individual buildings in their districts to greater detail. So there is detailed information. Keep in mind that Arizona separates that to a large degree between the inventory forms and the nomination.
Bill, I'm going to keep you on with another question. And this is one I struggle with. Counting resources, you briefly touched on it. So sort of simple if you have just one building, but oftentimes we don't. Even our single building nominations might have outbuildings, additions that are just as big as the original building. We have landscapes. They have features in the landscapes, groupings of features. How are we supposed to count these?
Well, I brought up that bulletin that has the detailed descriptions of how to treat contributing and non-contributing features. So there is formal guidance on that. So look that up. But let me just say a couple of things. It isn't necessary for you to count every little tiny element of that's in a district. And I think I saw Jen Levstick's name on our list of attendees. She has a nomination for a property in Tucson that's multifamily housing development, Villa del Rio by Benny Gonzalez and Bob Frankenberger. And that property includes a lot of things like mailboxes and the like. There are structures that there are lots of out there that need to be counted. But the keeper came back and said, don't count those individually, count them as a type. So don't say there's 100 mailboxes out there. Say one object, mailbox. And then in your description of section 7, you'll say, well, there's 100 of these around there, but they're all the same. So you don't have to say there are hundreds and hundreds of things when you can consolidate types of features that are minor in themselves into a larger type of site feature. Again, go to the bulletin for detailed description and advice.
Thank you. Yes, I will stop being so critical of people's counts when I don't agree then. I will go look at the guidance. With only 10 minutes left, I'd like to open up questions to the audience. You've all been so quiet, largely because your mics are turned off, but you can type very easily into the chat, which on my screen is a little icon at the bottom. We've had some good comments, but not many questions for our speakers.
I'd like to just I noticed a comment in the chat that I wanted to just make reference to. The talk about the character defining features should be included in the district nomination, and I certainly agree with that. I actually, I tend to keep the identification and the description of character defining features, and in within section 8, and so that I didn't want to. I shouldn't, I sort of maybe minimized it because I was thinking about it only in terms of section 7, but certainly that is true that needs to be addressed in section 8 more thoroughly.
Thank you. We have a question here that I believe Donna Reiner is best poised to answer about how to sign up for tomorrow's section 8.
You should be able to go back onto the registration for section 7. And you have to kind of scroll down and it says to register for section 8, click here. And we tested it out. So it should give you just section 8. And if not, contact Connie, and you should have her email because she's the one that has sent out the link for today's session, and she can help you through that. But it should be there.
Actually, I will be sending the link to everyone on today's webinar as well.
Okay.
So no worries there. No need to register.
All right. Thank you, Connie.
I do have one more question, which was, my opinion, sort of out there, but interesting nevertheless, if there was radio silence from our audience, which it appears there is. No one's written questions in the past couple of minutes. This is for Bill, and it's because I know what the answer is already, but I'd like it discussed. Have you ever had an experience where a CLG, a certified local government, their review was at odds with a SHPO review of a National Register nomination? And what happens in that case?
CLGs, or certified local governments, are cities and towns that have their own historic preservation programs, ordinances, and commissions, for those who aren't familiar with that term. And they are involved in the National Register nomination process because they have the privilege of reviewing nominations before they are heard by our state review board, the Historic Sites Review Committee. And so they can provide their advice on whether the property is eligible and whether the form is complete and accurate. And just as our review board will come back to prepare us with their own perspectives, CLGs can have their own perspectives. That can be on, for example, whether a particular criteria is appropriate or maybe some other thought should be added to it. They can question, the eligibility or classification of a particular property in a district. Just to give an example that Chris Evans is working with a nomination for Windsor Park Historic District in Tucson. The City of Tucson CLG review asked to revisit some of those properties and to give a second look at whether they should be contributors and contributors or non-contributors. So they contribute in that way. CLGs can actually even be even more at odds. They can actually oppose a nomination if they feel a property isn't eligible or have any other reason for not wanting to see it go forward. They can make that comment.
Thank you. There are two questions I think that are for you in chat if you have it open, but I'll read it for everybody.
Yeah.
Andrea wants to know, how difficult is it to add buildings to an existing National Register district?
That can depend on what you mean by adding a building. If you're talking about expanding a boundary, that is a new nomination on its own and can be quite a chore, depending on the size of what you're doing. Chris, did you work on that Sam Hughes district expansion recently? I forgot.
I did.
Yeah, so I don't know if there's if you want to add to this, but so that you can add properties to a district by expanding the boundaries. You can also change the classification of properties within them. So when a district is nominated, the properties will be classified as contributors or non-contributors, but that can be amended as time goes by. Properties that are contributors can go one way, or properties can be restored and go the other way. So yes, changes can be made.
I think the Cano Palmcroft Historic District is a perfect example, Bill, of how you can modify the boundaries and add other properties, et cetera. And there are a multitude of documents there. Some of them are where there was a house that they said wasn't a non-contributor based upon its age, but they found out later on that it actually had the age, and there's the documentation for it. In other cases, they added to either the boundaries of the district, or they added architectural types and stuff. So they said, we have another architectural type that we want to put into there, and we've got that in. It is kind of a jumbled mess in the way that they've got it listed up there. I think there's if you pull up the spreadsheet for it, there's like 4 listings, but there's only really 3, and the order of them is kind of messed up. But it gives a great example of the variations that you would see in making that type of change of either adding buildings, taking buildings out, changing boundaries and architectural types. And it's done over time. I mean, I think the original documentation is 1984, and it was like modifications made in 86, 88, 89, 90, 91, and just goes on and on and on until most recently, where there was a delisting of a property. So it's almost like a living, breathing example of change within a National Register district.
Thank you. I don't want Jen Lipstick's question to go unanswered as we close in. Bill, again, probably for you, how do we reconcile the desire for concise descriptions by our HSRC, Historic Site Review Committee, but with our new NPS reviewer who likes very detailed descriptions? What's the sweet spot to satisfy both?
Well, the National Register even has a best practices review built on how advising people to be concise. They keep saying that they want conciseness, and I don't have enough experience yet for background for other listeners. We have, as I said, we have a new reviewer at the Keeper's Office who recently returned several nominations that we had pending. So she is a hard reader of these nominations. I haven't determined that what she wants is extensive detail, as opposed to strict adherence to this is the way this space is supposed to be filled out. That's not quite the same thing. I haven't necessarily read that she wants more, but she wants it done in a particular way.
Okay.
We have much to learn with our new reviewer. I'm not sure I can fully answer that question.
Indeed. And I think that closes out the panel for today. Thank you for joining us. This was fun to participate in. I will hand the presentation back to Ms. Donna Reiner.
Okay, well, thank you so much, the panelists, and for those who attended. And as Connie said, she will be sending out the link for tomorrow, which is the sequel, getting Section 8 correct or right. And our presenter is not only well versed in writing the Section 8, but he also sits on the Arizona State Historic Sites Review, so he can look at it from the other perspective as what do I see and how do we deal with that? So if that's, I wish all of you a best day for the rest of today. Thank you.